Well, good evening. How are you this evening? You guys are my heroes. In the decade plus that I have been traveling from venue to venue and sharing and teaching and speaking, Sunday night is historically the lowest turnout every time, without exception. And so the fact that you're here this evening, you guys are my favorites. Don't tell the rest of the group as they come back tomorrow night, but you guys are my favorites. I want to start off, we've got a lot of questions this evening. You can tell once people are starting to feel comfortable because then they start asking questions. And we got 5 of them from last night, and I want to actually address 3 of them right here at the beginning, and then the other 2 we'll save until at the end of the intermission. But this first one, it says, as a pastor, how do you justify or find peace in continuing to be a part of a church that has caused so much damage and pushed so many away from a relationship with Jesus, including me? And this question tonight is my top priority, even out of the presentations. Whichever it was that who asked this one, I do want to clarify. Number one, I'm not a pastor. I'm not employed by a church. So I can't speak to that. I don't subscribe to a clergy-laity divide. I am just a normal person like you who has a passion to teach. Number one, I don't call myself a pastor. I rarely call myself a Christian. There's 4 days out of the week, and hopefully you'll understand this. There's 4 days out of the week that I'm not even comfortable calling myself a Christian, just because of what Christianity has come to be known for. The other 3 days of the week, I'm back and forth. Every day of the week, I'm trying to follow Jesus. Do you understand what I mean by that? Every day of the week, I'm enamored by Jesus. So I don't try to justify it, and I haven't found peace. I don't have any peace about these types of stories. I stick around because I believe, and I'm speaking to whoever it was who asked this, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I stick around because I believe Christians of all have lost sight of who Jesus is. I was raised in a Christianity where I too drank the Kool-Aid, where my favorite form of Jesus was the Jesus on the cross, because that's when He's dead and silent. I had missed out on His teachings. I had missed out on what the meaning of His resurrection was. So I feel your pain. And I'm sticking around because I would love for Christians to meet Jesus again. But I don't justify what's been done to you, and I don't have any peace over what's happened to you. I don't know your story, but I know stories like yours, and I'm just sorry. That's all I can say, is I'm sorry. And I don't want to be a different kind of Christian. I think Christianity needs to be honest about its history. This is what it is. Can't pretend it's not something that it isn't. But I do want to be different. I want to follow Jesus, and I'm hoping, and people say I'm crazy, that it's futile. But I'm hoping that Christianity, after 1,700 years of the Constantinian shift, can come back to what the early church had. So that's my answer to that. I feel it. I don't have an answer. I can just tell you where I'm at with it. The next question, and I hope that helps you in some way. I hope it helps you in some way. The next question is, can you please discuss free will versus choice a bit further? I've come to believe that love cannot exist without free will. And the question goes on, but that's you're right. We agree on what you mean by those terms. We're on the same page. When I was, and once again, this is not a philosophical series. It's an ethical values series. And when we talk about the existence of free will or not, we have just moved out of ethics into philosophy. But I will say this. First of all, don't get sidetracked on that. That's not what this series is about. But I will say this. Love requires choice. How many would agree with that? The freedom to make a choice. Christians get in trouble when you try to explain human suffering on the basis of free will. And if you don't understand that, I would encourage you to go sit down and have an open conversation with your local agnostic or atheist. Because what you mean by free will is not the academic definition of free will. And what you're meaning is the ability to choose left or the ability to choose right. And how many would agree, if you're a theist in this room, you believe in a God that has given you the choice to choose or reject that God? How many would agree with that? That's but the term for that is choice, not free will. The academic of free will is a human choice that is made in a vacuum of freeness where there are no influences. Your will has never been coerced, but it has been influenced every waking moment of your life. You have the ability to choose. Did everyone hear me say that? Choose, yes or no. So that's what you're meaning by free will, and I agree with that. But the academic definition of free will is to make a choice without that choice being influenced by anything. And I don't think any human being has ever been able to make a choice that was purely out from under any influence. I mean, that's the work of the liberating Jesus, is to liberate the human will so they can make a free choice. So it's an academic discussion that I was giving a nod to in passing as we were discussing this topic, because of, if there are agnostics or atheists listening, I want you to understand that I'm hearing you and I'm hearing that debate, and I'm not really engaging that debate. I'm just saying we have a choice. And so hopefully that helps make sense. The last question we're going to deal with at this point, well, it's two, but it's on the same sheet of paper. If God is all-powerful, how come He can't do something? First of all, the all-powerful quality of God is a Hellenistic Greek idea. Again, that's Hellenistic, the Hellenistic influence in Christianity. The primary attribute of God from the Jesus story is not all-powerful. It's that God is what? Love. And it's love that constrains what you can and cannot do. Are you with me so far? Does that make sense? In other words, if you love someone, there are certain ways you cannot treat them. The New Testament gives examples of how it's impossible for God to lie. The Greeks want a God where nothing's impossible for God. Well, if God's going to play by the rules of love, and I would submit to you that that's what the God of the Jesus story is, there's certain things of God of love can and cannot do. And how you philosophically reconcile that with an all-powerful God, I've not been able to do it yet. But I find it interesting that John didn't walk away from 3 years with Jesus and say, God is omnipotent, all-powerful. He walked away from the Jesus encounter and he said, God is love. And if you have been a parent, and I'm speaking out of my own parenthood. I'm not saying everybody has to be a parent, or if you're not a parent, you're less of a person. I'm just simply saying, if you have been a parent, you know that your love for that child restrains you from being able to do some things and being able to do some things and enables you to do some others. So there's that relational dynamic. And again, these questions are philosophical in nature, and this series is not built to answer those philosophies, though we want to enter into a dialectic relationship with them as well. So this last one is, and that's why I've saved it to the very end, it's on the same sheet of paper, what is the kingdom? Woohoo! Welcome to the first half of tonight. Last night, the gospel Jesus preached was, the kingdom has arrived. All I wanted you to see last night, and remember, the biggest objection to following Jesus today is that Christians care only about getting to heaven, and they don't care about ending human suffering. The statistic is 73% of theists, when they see injustice, they do how much? Nothing about it. Because that's the objection. Last night, what we were entering into dialogue with that, saying that yes, that may be what you've encountered within Christianity, but within the Jesus narrative, Jesus isn't focused on getting to heaven, but bringing heaven into people's lives in a here and in the now. It's very much focused on bringing it into human suffering. How many can see that in the Jesus story? He's very much focused on bringing people's suffering today to an end. The point of last night was to get our focus off of escaping this messed up world and getting to some other cosmological existence, and instead engaging in this world and being a conduit of healing, restoration, transformation, redemption. This world focus is learning that Jesus' primary focus was not heaven, but the kingdom. And that is well documented within Christian resources. That's almost indisputable. It was the kingdom of heaven, but it was the kingdom that had come from heaven to earth. So what is this kingdom that Jesus talked about? What is it? We made the focus change last night, but now that we're not focused on escape, but actually on what Jesus preached, what was he talking about when he taught about the kingdom? Notice almost every one of Jesus' parables starts off with what phrase? The kingdom of heaven is like. And every one of his stories is trying to define this for us. I will say this, that kingdoms as they are defined here on earth is not what Christ's kingdom is like. How many are thankful for that? Now, is it present here on this earth? Through Jesus' death and resurrection, are we to go out and announce the kingdom of God has come near, that it's here? Are we to announce that? Yes, it's the already but not yet that some people refer to, that it's here, but it's in a very obstructed form. How many would agree with that? There's stuff in its way. It's in a mustard seed form. It's in the weed form, the leaven form, where it's still working its way through the dough and through the garden. Jesus spent the majority of his time trying to define what this kingdom is. In Mark 1, 14 through 15, again it says, "Now after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God, saying, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is coming, has come near. Rethink everything." That's what repentance means. Someone came up to me last night and said, "Man, this is really causing me to think about some stuff." That's repentance. Are you with me? If you're rethinking some things, that's the Greek definition of repentance. Repent, rethink, and believe in the good news. Jesus starts off in Luke 4, and we're going to come back to Luke 4 tomorrow night, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here. But this is where the Jesus of Luke's gospel starts. He's in a synagogue one Sabbath, and he grabs the scroll of Isaiah. He turns to the place in Isaiah where it reads this way, "The Spirit of the Lord is" what? Upon me. Now that was a very Jewish phrase. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Anybody here familiar with the Old Testament book of Judges? Anyone familiar with that book? It's an awful book, by the way, but it's horrendous. But there's a certain form that book takes. Israel would fall under oppression. In other words, Israel would end up at which end of the pyramid? At the bottom. And the God of the book of Judges would raise up a judge or a deliverer that would come and bring liberation to Israel in its oppression. And every time that judge would work towards liberation, the book of Judges says, the Spirit of the Lord came upon that person. How many remember when Samson, who is a fascinating example of how God may work through frailty, or however you want to define it, whenever he would show us an exercise of strength, or whether you agree with this or not, what was the language that was used right before he would show that form of strength? The Spirit of the Lord came upon. How many remember that language if you're familiar with it? This is what Jesus is doing. He's taking from Isaiah, he's taking from this Jewish heritage, and he's saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. What does that mean? In the Jewish mindset, what would that have meant? It's time for liberation. Liberation has come. Now, did Jesus look radically different than the type of judges that showed up in the book of Judges? Those judges were wielding a sword. Jesus came bearing a cross. We'll talk about that more 2 nights from now. But the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has, watch what it says, anointed me to bring good news to the who? The poor. And we cannot ignore this. To claim to be a follower of Jesus without having the same level of passion for the poor that Jesus had is a significant disconnect. Poverty is that which starts off the whole work of liberation. It's the launching pad. It's our point of departure. How many would agree there are pyramids of sickness in this world other than economic? How many would agree with that? But it's the economic one that Jesus starts us with because it is the one that hits home the most. It affects how many of us? All of us. It transcends all and includes all of the other pyramids. Because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. Some people say Jesus never talked about slavery. I want to just throw out one note in passing. Jesus actually said a lot about slavery if you have the cultural glasses on to see it. Slavery in our history was based on race. Slavery in the first century was based on not race, but economics. In other words, once you became poor enough, you would sell your land. Once you sold your land, then you would sell yourself. You would become a slave. The poor were, the poverty was the slavery of that day. It was different than what we have today. So when Jesus comes announcing the year of Jubilee, all debts forgiven, and calling on debtors to forgive those who are indebted to them, and calling on those who are indebted to them to forgive even those that are indebted to them, Jesus is announcing the liberation from slavery in the language of His day. If you can see that, say yes. So it's first good news to the poor, radical social change. He has sent me to proclaim release to the who? Captives. Because not only was there economic captivity, the entire nation of Israel was in captivity to who? To Rome. Rome controlled them economically through the temple. Rome determined who was going to be a priest every year, giving you some social context. And the recovery of sight to the who? To the blind. And this is the key, to let the oppressed go what? Free. Don't spiritualize this. Wherever we find oppression, if we are a follower of Jesus, we are to have a bias toward which side? Oppressors or the oppressed? The oppressed. Now, are we to love both sides? Yes. Are we to seek to restore and to redeem both sides? Do oppressors need saved from oppressive systems just as much as the oppressed do? Yes. But in that liberation, we have a bias towards which side? The oppressed, and we are calling on the oppressors to join us in that bias. That's how it changes. Jesus sought to replace, we'll talk about circles tomorrow night, but if you've been here previous nights, you'll understand this language. Jesus sought to replace a pyramid or a circle with a shared table. And what does that mean? That means everyone, regardless of where you're at, inside or outside or top or bottom, we're all invited to the same shared table. How many notice that in the Jesus story? He goes to this table, to this table, to this table, to this table. It was his socio-economic, political, religious model. Not a triangle, not a circle, a shared table. That is non-homogeneous. How many are thankful for that? Do you know what that means, non-homogeneous? Non-homogeneous means we're all not the same. We're all different. It's a heterogeneous table where everybody's voice is valued, everybody's story is valued, and as we encounter the varied experiences of life that everyone has, the different experiences everyone at the table has had in life, and we listen to those, all of a sudden there's a new human community that emerges out of that shared table. It's what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. It's what the early church called the shared table. It's actually what the early church called the church. It was a group of human beings forming a community that was centered around, rooted in the teachings of Jesus. And they were putting on display an alternative way of doing life here on planet Earth. How many began to see a window into what that looked like last night? Do you remember that moment in last night's presentation where it all of a sudden it clicked for you and you could feel the energy in the room? It was like, wow, yeah, that's the kind of world I want to be a part of. How many remember that moment from last night? That's what we're talking about here. No more pyramids, no more circles. We come together as a shared table. You and I are not called to change the world because we can't. How many are thankful for that? We are called to put on display the beauty of what a world changed by the teachings of Jesus looks like, and to invite others to join us. It's called the revolution. I fear to call it the church, because the church historically, the church has been complicit in much oppression, participants in some oppression. But originally the church meant this alternative human society. It was very subversive. It was the mustard seed. It was where the kingdom was, it was the conduit through which the kingdom was starting to grow in the garden of this world. So he goes on and he begins to define it some more. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. That is our message too. Matthew chapter 5. We looked at it last night from Luke chapter 6, which is Luke's Sermon on the Plain. Tonight we're going to be looking at it from Matthew chapter 5. And a little window into my own story, Matthew chapter 5 is what ruined my life. I am not a sinner who found religion. My story is that of a deeply religious person who one day met Jesus. And it was through Jesus' teachings here that we're about to look at. I'm not saying that I do it well. I am quite comfortable admitting to all of you in the room that although I endeavor to follow that Jesus, I do it quite poorly. Anyone else resonate with that? I do it quite poorly. But that is the endeavor of my life. That is the practice that I am leaning into. I want to follow what I read here. So let's begin. What was it that Jesus taught? When he saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the," what? Poor. But then he throws in two new words now. Poor where? Now, they're new to you because we've not looked at this phrase yet. I want to work backwards a little bit and see if I can get it to go backwards some. Get all the scribbles out. Luke says just the poor. Did you notice that? Luke 6 last night, he said, "Blessed are the poor, woe are the rich." There's no in spirit there. How many noticed that in Luke? In Luke 4, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to give good news to the poor." There is no poor in spirit there. Luke just says the poor. Matthew's the one that actually adds this in spirit. Culturally, the way in spirit was used, look over in your gray section. 1 Corinthians 5:3. Paul says to the believers in Corinth, he writes, "For though absent in the body, I am present in" what? What did this mean in body, in the flesh versus in the spirit? What did this mean here? It meant that I'm not present with you physically, but I am with you where? In my heart. Look at it again in Colossians. For though I am absent in body, yet I am with you in what? So what? Think of the triangle for a moment. Who would be poor in spirit? See if you can put it together. Can you contemplate it? First of all, would it be, just some diagnostic questions, would it be people at the bottom? No, because they're actually poor. And we're talking about the economic pyramid of Luke chapter 4 that Jesus is referring to. They wouldn't be poor in spirit. They would be poor in reality. When he said, I'm not with you in body, I'm with you in spirit, he's not there in reality. Are you with me? He's there in his heart. So number one, who would be the poor in spirit? It would be people at the top who have embraced these teachings of Jesus, and they're standing in solidarity now with the poor. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I'm poor in spirit. I'm standing with the poor in spirit. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the what? Again, the kingdom of heaven is biased towards which side of the pyramid? Talk to me so we can go home tonight. Which side? The bottom. And those that are standing in solidarity with the bottom, the kingdom is for you as well. If that makes sense, say yes. It says, blessed are those who what? Blessed are those who what? Mourn, for they will be, what does it say? Comforted. Again, as we saw in Luke last night, this is nothing new, so we can move quickly through it. Are there people presently mourning as a result of pyramids and circles? Through the shared table, would they be comforted? Hopefully, if everyone starts listening to everyone at the table. If there's that mutualness there that we're going to see in the book of Acts later in this series. Matthew 5:5, blessed are the what? The meek. And this is so important, for they will... This is so counterintuitive. Because typically those at the bottom, they feel they have to overpower those at the top for change to be made. How many have seen those types of revolutions in human history? Jesus is just as revolutionary, but it's not through mustering up enough strength to overpower those at the top. As counterintuitive as it is, and there have been those that have caught it. Leo Tolstoy, how many know that name? Leo Tolstoy is one that saw this. Gandhi is another. How many know that name? Gandhi is another that sought to bring those changes through meekness rather than violent overthrow. Martin Luther King Jr. is another one. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is a method where you're seeking to win your enemies, not conquer your enemies. Do you understand the difference? It is meekness that's going to change the world. What I also want you to notice, and this one we're going to have to chew on, and hopefully this will be good news to those of you who were here yesterday evening. He says, the blessed are the meek, for they will go to heaven. Is that what he says? Do you see it? Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the end of the book of Revelation. It ends, although it transits through, it ends where? In a new heaven and a new earth, where we're living here. And that word new, we need to understand there are two Greek words for new. There's neos and kainos. Neos is the Greek word translated for new. Anybody want to learn a little Greek tonight? Little Greek never killed anybody. A little Hebrew once did, but little Greek never did. Never mind. I think Alexander was little in Greek. Never mind. Corny joke. Cheesy. Neos means I have a coffee maker on my counter. It broke. I threw it in the trash, and I went and bought a new one. Neos. How many coffee makers then would I have? 2. The one that's broken and the new one. Are you with me? Kainos is my coffee maker broke and I restored it to being brand new. It's a new coffee maker. How many coffee makers do I have? One. But it's not the old version, it's the new one. When Jesus was resurrected in the story, could you say, well, there's his old body still there in the tomb, so that there was two bodies, an old one and a new one? Could you do that? The old one was used up and transformed into the new one. Does that make sense this evening? Whenever the early church spoke about a new heavens and a new earth, even if it's through the purification of fire, as some epistles speak of, it is never neos, new heavens and new earth. It is always kainos, new heavens and new earth. And what that should tell us is we are not arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. For how many is that good news? You are creating realities that will exist in the new heaven and the new earth, in this heaven and in this earth. There are things that will pass through the fire and only be made more beautiful by them. And that's a great privilege. That's something to be a part of. Look at the next one. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what? Most of you may be familiar with the translation of righteousness. The reason I use this translation is because righteousness too often has been a religious term where you're trying to attain a certain level of moralistic behavior to earn the acceptance and favor of a God. That's not what Jesus is referring to. Are there people under the present arrangement that are hungering and thirsting for justice? Now, something else we have to also be aware of is that Jesus did not define justice the typical way. Many times in revolutions as we know them, revolutions that follow the way of the world, of this world, revolutions call for justice too, but too often that justice is retributive or it's punitive. How many have noticed? We want to make them pay for what they did to us. How many have noticed that? Let me ask you this. I want you to think of everyone that's ever hurt you in your life and think of some pretty doozies. Would it be enough for you for Jesus to transform that person that has hurt you and make them a radically different person? Or do you need them still to pay for what they did on top of that change? Are you hearing what I'm asking? If you're okay with just Jesus changing them, and you, by the way, but changing them, then what you're really hungering for is not a retributive justice. You're hungering for what kind of justice? Restorative. Transformative justice. And that's what Jesus is talking about. Jesus isn't talking about anybody getting revenge. Jesus is talking about, yes, you getting justice, not charity. The prophets did not call it charity. They called it justice. You getting justice, but at the same time, those who are committing injustice against you being radically transformed into justice as well. It says, blessed are the what? The next one. Blessed are the what? The merciful, for they will what? What's it going to require from those at the top that want punitive justice? An eye for an eye, although Moses commanded it, leaves the whole world what? And where did Gandhi learn that from? Who did Gandhi learn that from? Do you know? There was an itinerant Jewish carpenter who went around through Galilee saying, I know you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I'm telling you, love your enemies. How many are thankful that at the heart of the revolution Jesus came to inaugurate is not a vindictiveness, but it's the way of enemy love? How many are thankful for that? We're going to talk about that one. That's again 2 nights from now, and we talk about the way of enemy love. I want to encourage you to come back for that. Friedrich Nietzsche, some people wonder why I would quote that guy in a series about Jesus, because he's right on this. He said, he who fights monsters so should see to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze for too long into the abyss gazes also into you. Do you know what he means by that? The methods we use must match the ends that we are trying to reach. If they don't, if our methods and our ends are not together, if we're trying to reach a more love-based world through unloving means, then what we end up doing, as you've often seen, is just turning the pyramid upside down, which just places a new group in the position of oppression. How many have seen that happen before as well? Jesus isn't wanting just to cause problems. He's wanting to create a solution to the problems. The shared table, as we're going to talk about tomorrow night, has an incredible power for good. But it requires those who hunger and thirst for justice to be merciful. Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will what? See God. Matthew 5:9, blessed are the what? Notice it doesn't say peacekeepers. Is there a difference between a peacekeeper and a peacemaker? I can keep the peace as long as I'm the biggest bully on the hill. Are you with me? And sometimes we need to be careful, because sometimes freedom just means you're the biggest bully on the hill. Process that for a second. As followers of Jesus, we are not called to be peacekeepers. We're called to be peacemakers. And peacemakers calls for change in our society, does it not? Because true peace is not, as King said, the absence of conflict. True peace is the presence of, do you know the statement? Justice. And it's justice for how many at the table? For all of them. That's when we have peace. It's peace by peaceful means, and we'll talk about more of that 2 nights in a row. When we talk about 2 nights from now, when we get to the way of enemy love. Blessed are those who are persecuted for justice's sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you start preaching this stuff that I've just preached, just these 9 verses, everybody likes the idea of enemy love until you start defining who that enemy actually is. Everybody loves the idea of a loving God until you say that loving God loves your enemies too. See, you start preaching the stuff that Jesus taught just in these 9 verses, and before long, do you know what's going to happen? You're going to be persecuted for justice's sake. Now, do not misunderstand this. That doesn't mean that if you're being persecuted, you must be doing something right. You could just be a jerk. People might genuinely not like you. But the flip side is true. If you do this, just because you are persecuted doesn't mean you're a follower of Jesus. But if you're a follower of Jesus not experiencing any persecution, that should create some questions in your mind. And I don't mean persecution the way the Christian right is using it right now in the culture wars. What I mean by persecution is when you start sticking up for those at the bottom, what's going to happen to your relationships with those at the top? When you start, do I do this? When you start sticking up for the poor, is it going to make the rich at least uncomfortable? Yeah. When you think of other forms of oppression, when you start sticking up for women, is it going to make some men uncomfortable? I know none of you men in this room, but is it going to make some men uncomfortable? Have you ever witnessed that? I feel like you don't know what I'm talking about right now. Has anyone ever seen what I'm describing, or am I just pulling it out of thin air? When you start standing up for non-whites, are you going to make some whites uncomfortable? Yeah. I know, again, nobody in this room. But is it going to happen? You start preaching about the topics that Jesus preached about. Sometimes I think we like the idea of Jesus. Most Christians have accepted, and I know it's a judgment call. God's going to have to root that judgmentalism out of me. But I'm becoming more and more convinced that in Western Americanized Christianity, most Christians have accepted heaven. They've not accepted the teachings of Jesus. When you start teaching what Jesus taught, you become passionate about the passions Jesus was passionate about. There is going to be some persecution. Jesus says, if that's why you're being persecuted, because you're in solidarity in spirit with those at the bottom, then you are blessed. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Notice, he repeats what he says at the very beginning. He brings it back around. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the what? If you're really standing in solidarity with them, the kingdom's going to be yours too, but along with persecutions. Blessed are the poor. Start sticking up for the underdog. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Blessed are you when people revile you, when they persecute you, when they utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Now that in heaven, don't get mixed up about that. The kingdom is from heaven, is it not? And is there a reward reserved for you in heaven? But if you come over to my house, and it's a hot day, and let's say I live here in Oklahoma, and I heard it gets hot here in the summertime. Is that true? Let's say I've got a nice, cold, refreshing beverage reserved for you over there in the refrigerator. Do you have to open up that refrigerator, get inside that refrigerator, close the refrigerator door on you, and be in the refrigerator yourself for you to enjoy that beverage? That word picture is kind of silly, isn't it? No, it's reserved for you there, but what are you going to do? You're going to walk over to the refrigerator, and this is what the great New Testament scholar N.T. Wright shares. You open up the refrigerator, you pull out the beverage, and you enjoy it where? Yeah, in the living room somewhere, in the kitchen, or outdoors on your patio. Yes, it's reserved for you in heaven, which means nobody can corrupt it. Nobody can take it away from you. But we will enjoy it here. And it says, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The prophets, what the truest identifying mark of a prophet is someone who stands up for those who are being oppressed. That's the sign of being a prophet. And the Hebrew prophets, they were standing up against Jewish kings and a Jewish priestly class. They're standing up for the widows, the fatherless, the poor. Luke 6, then he looked at his disciples and said, we covered this last night, so we're going to go very quickly. Blessed are you who are poor, yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, when they revile you and defame you on account of the Son of Man. The Son of Man, this was what the Hebrews called the beloved human community. What King called the beloved community, what the early Christians called the shared table. This is the Son of Man, the Baranasha is what the Hebrew phrase is. It was centered in Jesus. That was this human community. That's how they referred to it. It's found in Daniel chapter 7, by the way. If you just want some trivia, you can look it up for homework. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward in heaven is great. For that is what their ancestor did to the prophets. But woe to you who are what? Rich. Now I want to zero in on this again. This statement is why Jesus got killed. Talking like this, remember, this wasn't just wealth disparity. It wasn't about the dispossessed and the privileged. If you were wealthy back then, it meant you must be righteous, for you're being blessed by who? Jesus is turning even the moral evaluation of people in society on its head and saying, no, it's them that God's heart is standing in solidarity with, not you. Woe to you. Now, is he condemning them? No. Is he feeling genuine sorrow for them? Why? Because are they initially going to rejoice at these teachings, or are they going to be made uncomfortable by them? Are they going to find it easy to embrace the changes Jesus came to make? Or are they going to find it difficult? If Jesus showed up here in this room tonight and told all of us in this room, to sell everything we have and give it away to the poor, be honest, would you find that easy or very difficult? I can tell you how I would find it. Very difficult. Why? Because where do I sit economically? I'm at the top of the pyramid. Maybe not the very top, but I'm in the top half. At least globally. I'm going to find it difficult. Now, I want to also qualify all of that by saying all of us are both simultaneously oppressed and privileged. Aren't we all? In some area of our life, we are oppressed. In another area of our life, we are privileged. I know some of you may be women. So in the gender area, it is no secret that women make less than men in our country here today. Isn't that true? So in that area, you're going to be a little less privileged. But the fact that you're a white woman makes a difference than if you're a black woman. Do you see what I'm saying? And we're all mixed. Mine is horrible. I have got so many, what's the word I'm looking for? I have got so many things that keep you from seeing. I don't want to say disadvantage because that's not the term that I have the right to use. But when you can't see something, what is it? Yeah, I am blinded to it. I don't know what the term is, but you know what it means now. I have so many blind spots because I am male. I will never know what it's like to be a woman in this country. That's why I need women to sit at the table with me and help me see, help me understand. I'm white. I'll never know what it's like to live in this country as non-white. That's why I need non-whites at the table. Are you hearing me? To help me see my blind spots. And how many can see that if we started just doing life just like this, I don't have to worry about where my next meal's coming from. That's why I need those who are worried about where their next meal is going to come from, sitting at this table with me, so that I can understand what a world that is just for everyone's going to look like. How many can begin to see that if we started orchestrating a human community around Jesus' shared table, it has the power to put on display a radically beautiful way of doing life here on earth? How many can see that? Only two of you. Well, I'll keep hammering at it. You're going to struggle with it. I am the ones who Jesus would say woe to. I am in this text in the woe category. I need those that are in the first category. Well, I used to be someone who everyone spoke well of. Mark 10:21. This I find great courage or great comfort in. Jesus looked at him and what's the word? Loved him. Does Jesus feel love for whatever dynamic we're talking about? Does Jesus feel love for those at the top? Yeah, he does. He says, you lack one thing. Go and sell what you own and give the money to the poor and you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Man, those are hard words, but why did Jesus share it with them? Because he loved him. And that's why it's rooted in enemy love. Because I don't want to belittle what others have suffered that I will never have to suffer. But I do contest that I need saved from this and my blindness to it, just as much as those at the bottom need saved from this. And I am thankful for a Jesus that loves me too and is inviting me to step into a world that's different. Luke 6:27-36, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those that what? Now this is interesting. Why is he saying this right? He just said, blessed are you when people hate you. And then he turns around and says, but you are to what? Love those that. Are we given permission to hate back? No, because hate only escalates. We're to love those that are made uncomfortable. But if love for those who disagree with you as a Jesus follower, if love for those who disagree with you is not being increased, then you need to come back and spend some time in contemplation with Luke 6:27 through 36. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other also. How many were here last night when I gave a little bit of an explanation of this? If you missed it, we're going to cover it 2 nights from now again. If someone takes away your coat, don't withhold your shirt. This is problematic because this is before the invention of the fruit of the looms. So if you're an impoverished person and you only own 2 articles of clothing and they're wanting to sue you for one of them and Jesus is telling you to get rid of the other, in what state is that going to leave you?
Arkansas.
And this is where we begin to see how non-conventional Jesus really was. Because in this culture, think about the story that was very cherished by them of Noah. And whether you subscribe to that scientifically or not, I'm not debating that tonight. But in the narrative of the Noah story, do you remember when Noah's son, the youngest son walked in, and what was the problem? He saw Noah's what? And the other sons, how did they fix it? They walked in backwards so as to not look on their father's nakedness. In that culture, and I'll explain more about this when we come back to this passage and show you some cultural proof for this, but in that culture, the shame was never on the one who was naked. That could have happened at any point by accident. The shame was always on the one who looked on that nakedness. So when Jesus is saying, if they're coming after you for your one of the last 2 articles of clothing, you give them both and you just stand there stark how? As if to say, shame on you. Because in that moment, you are confronting this injustice. How many can see that? You're not being passive. Neither are you being violent. You are being confrontative, but you're being confrontative in such a way that you're hoping not to conquer your enemy, but to awaken your enemy to a sense of what even they themselves are entrapped in and to call them away from it to stand with you in spirit. Do you see how it works? Whether we like it or not, Jesus here is actually endorsing public nudity as a valid form of nonviolent protest. How many think that's cool? The younger audience does. The younger audience does. He goes on and says, give to everyone who asks of you. If anyone takes what belongs to you, don't demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. He sums it all up. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend them because they need saved too. They need redeemed from this too, just as much as you do. Lend to them expecting to not get anything back. This has deep implications and roots in their tradition of the year of Jubilee. And this is why Jesus came announcing the year of Jubilee, all debts forgiven. I was introduced to a ministry recently called Rolling Jubilee. Anybody ever heard of Rolling Jubilee before? Let me recommend this to you. It is one of the coolest economic ministries being done by people of faith that I have bumped into. How many are aware of the dynamic that debt institutions like banks and credit card companies, after 180 days, they have to sell their bad debt? And what they do is they usually sell it for pennies on the dollar to companies that are going to come after you if you're in debt to them. And it's a big money-making business because you can buy debt for pennies on the dollar, and then even if you just collect a few of those debts, you've made all your money back plus. Anybody know how that's how the system works? Rolling Jubilee is a ministry, very cool ministry, that's raising money you can donate to buy debt for pennies on the dollar. And then do you know what they do with that debt? Instead of going after it, and 60% of it's medical debt. Instead of going after it, you know what they do as followers of Jesus? They just say, debt's canceled. Have a great day. We just took care of your debt for you. How many think that's a cool ministry? That's what we're talking about here. That's a new world. That's awesome. That's awesome. But this lend without anything, expecting anything back. Once it got close to the year of Jubilee, people would stop lending because they knew that 2 years from now, the debt would be what? And so they were ignoring people's need. And Jesus says, don't do that. Then your reward will be great and you'll be children of the Most High because God is kind to who? The ungrateful and usually those at the top think that of people at the bottom. But who he's talking about here are those who are not at the bottom, but those that are at the top. And he's wanting us to try to redeem them. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. I'm going to close this first half tonight with just 3 quotations. We've covered so much of this in previous nights, laying the foundation for it, that I think we get it. How many can see that Jesus' teachings were very practical, first and foremost? How many can see that? It wasn't spiritualized. It wasn't great theology. It was trying to make a practical difference in people's lives in the here and now. Jesus cared about people's physical health. How many can see that? But he also cared about their economic health. How many can see that? He cared about their religious health, their social health, their political health. And he sought to bring healing in all of these areas. And as followers of Jesus, we are to be as well. Not just caring about people's physical health, but health in all their areas of life. And not just, how do I say this correctly? As followers of Jesus, we're not just to keep patching the holes in the present boat that enables the boat to go on unchallenged. We are to be putting on display a radically different boat, what a radically different world looks like. And in that process, we're unmasking the present boat. That's such a bad analogy. It's the holes in the boat is what I was going for. But it's such a bad analogy. God is passionate. The God of Jesus is passionate about a world where there's enough for everyone, not because charity exists, but because there's just enough for everyone. And the early church was putting on what a world that looks like that looks like, putting on display what a world that looks like that looks like. And in that process, it was threatening to those who were being benefited by the present system, saying, nope, the world has to look like this. And they were saying, no, there can be a world that looks like this. And was that, to quote Colossians, disarming the powers? Was it exposing the powers, making a public shame of the powers? Absolutely. So here's my 3 quotes that I want to end this first half with you. The first 2 are from Peter Gomes. He was a professor at Harvard, African-American. He wrote the book, The Scandalous Gospel of Jesus, What's So Good About the Good News? These are 2 of my favorite statements from that book. If you haven't read the book, it's a fantastic book. When the gospel says the last will be first and the first will be last, despite the fact that it is counterintuitive to our cultural presuppositions, it is invariably good news to those who are last and at least problematic to those who see themselves as first. I think that's a great statement, very qualifying statement, helping us get back in touch with how radical Jesus' teachings really were. He goes on to say, good news to some, and this is the real one. This is the one I really want to zero in on. The other was just appetizer. This is the main course. Good news to some will almost inevitably be bad news to others. In other words, what was good news to some in Jesus' day was perceived as bad news by Caiaphas. How many would agree with that? When Jesus said, no more sacrifice, we're going to do away with the temple, that was bad news for the priests. How many would agree with that? Herod did not perceive it as good news, but bad. Pilate did not perceive it as good news, but bad. What is good news to some will almost always be bad news to others. In order that the gospel in the New Testament, this is what has happened, might be made as palatable as possible to as many as possible, its rough edges have been shorn off, and the radical edge of Jesus' preaching has been replaced by a respectable middle, of which niceness is now God. In other words, we ignore those that are hurting, and everyone needs to be what? Nice. How many have seen that happen? How many have bumped into the reversal of that in just 3 nights in this series? Yes. When you start looking at what Jesus actually taught, that radical edge comes back almost in pure focus. And it says, when Jesus came preaching, it was to proclaim the ends of things as they are and the breaking in of things that are to be. How many does that make you excited? The end of things as they are, the breaking in of things as they are to be. This was the beginning of something new. He says the status quo is not to be criticized. It is to be what? Destroyed. It's being replaced. Old things are passing away. So I'll close with MLK. This is my favorite statement from Dr. King. This is the only way to create the beloved community. We must use Jesus' methods, which are rooted in enemy love. This is the only way to create the beloved community. To our most bitter opponents, we say, we shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We shall meet your physical force with, what does he say? Soul force. Do to us what you will. We shall continue to love you. We cannot in all good conscience obey your unjust laws because non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. I would remind you that even when Paul wrote Romans 13 about cooperating with the powers, he was writing that from what location? A Roman jail cell, that's right. Throw us in jail, King says, and we shall what? I love this. We'll still love you. How many wish a world functioned like that? Bomb our homes, threaten our children, and we shall still love you. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our communities at the midnight hour and beat us and leave us half dead, and we shall still love you. Where did he learn this from? Who did he learn this from? But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And one day we shall win freedom. But not only, and catch this, for ourselves. This is the magic of how Jesus' way works. Not only for ourselves, we shall so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we shall win you in the process. And our victory will be a double victory. How many does that inspire? That is beautiful. That is gospel. All we've done tonight is look at, once again, take a moment to pause in the series and look at the beginnings of the Sermon on the Mount. And we looked at Luke's entire Sermon on the Plain. Luke's is much more brief. The introduction to the Sermon on the Mount is affectionately called by many Christians does anyone know? The Beatitudes. That's right. That's all we looked at. We're going to be moving further into the Sermon on the Mount tomorrow night, and especially Tuesday night. Wednesday night, we're going to start looking at some objections to embracing Jesus. Some of those objections to embracing the teachings of Jesus, I will say, revolve around abuses that has been made by the Christian religion in relation to teachings of the Jesus. In other words, you can follow Jesus and not be like some of those Christians that you're concerned about becoming like. How many are thankful for that? There's a difference between, you can be different. So we'll talk about that. And then the next 2 nights, we'll talk about where do we go from here. What we're about to experience in the next 3 nights, there are going to be some of you are going to be glad when it's over. I know that. I've done this too many times not to realize that. But some of you are going to encounter something in the teachings of Jesus over the next 3 nights that you're just going to be hungry for more at the end. And you're like, how does this continue? How do I get more of this? I don't want this to stop with just this week. So we're going to wrap up the week with where do we go from here? How do you continue this and make this something long-lasting and permanent? This would be the beginning of something rather than the end. So that's where we're headed. Tomorrow night we're going to begin moving deeper into the Sermon on the Mount. How many are learning something new about the teachings of Jesus this week? How many are seeing some new things? Good for you. How many are being reminded of some things maybe you had forgotten? Anyone here? Yes. And how many of you are just thankful for the refresher? Anyone here just thankful for the refresher? It's a refresher for you, but you're thankful for it. Good, good. Repetition deepens impression. It's never a bad thing to spend some time with the teachings of Jesus. We're going to break for 15 minutes. Remember, if you haven't registered, do so for us. It's just telling us how you found out about it. Make sure you get your handout for your next series, next presentation. That one's going to be, much quicker. And then also, there's a third thing. Oh yeah, put your name in for the drawing. There's 2 more books being given away by Chris Blake tonight. Enjoy your refreshments. We'll see you in 15 minutes.